Aircraft accidents are always caused by a combination of several factors, and the thing that gets the sequence rolling is often something simple and mundane. But this is the first time I've ever come across a single letter kicking it off. Stay tuned. Whenever you hear the word Tenerife in aviation context, people almost always think of the world's worst aviation disaster, the collision between two Boeing 747s at Tenerife's Los Rodeos airport back in 1977. But the island of Tenerife, the largest of Spain's Canary Islands, actually suffered a string of disasters between the 1950s and the 1980s, who collectively claimed 950 lives. And that infamous runway collision was just the worst one of those. So today, I will tell you the story of the last major incident to happen there, a story that took place on a rainy spring day back in 1980. And this one, I think a lot fewer of you have ever heard of. In the morning of the 25th of April 1980, the crew of Dan Air Flight 1008 were preparing to depart from Manchester in England on a charter flight, bringing tourists down towards Tenerife North Airport, then known as Los Rodeos. During the 1970s and 80s, Dan Air was one of Britain's largest operators of inclusive tour flights, chartered by tour operators to transport fixed groups of people down to popular holiday destinations in southern Europe and North Africa. Among the aircraft types operated by Dan Air was the mighty Boeing 727, and Dan Air were actually the first British airline to import this model, which had then had to undergo several unique modifications in order to meet British safety standards. Now, it would later turn out that the 727s were a financial disaster for Dan Air, but by 1980 that was not yet very obvious. The aircraft that the crew were going to operate on this day was 14 years old, in generally good condition, and could seat a maximum of 144 passengers. So with a total of 138 passengers booked, it was almost completely full. The crew consisted of 5 flight attendants and 3 pilots, meaning that in total there were going to be 146 people on board once the flight got on the way. The pilot in command was a very experienced 50-year-old captain who had around 15,300 total flight hours, which included almost 2,000 on the Boeing 727. He had flown this route down to Tenerife North a full 58 times before this flight, making him very familiar with it in general. But as we will soon see, being familiar with the destination doesn't mean that it can't throw a few surprises. His second in command was a 34-year-old first officer, who on this day had about 3,500 hours in total, of which 618 were flown on the 727. And the third flight crew member was a 34-year-old flight engineer, whose experience was similar to that of the first officer. Now, all of the pilots had been off for more than 24 hours before this duty, and the scheduled departure time was at a very civilized hour, so there's no reason to believe that fatigue played any role in what was soon about to happen. Now, instead, the crew were likely in a quite good mood as they completed their normal pre-flight activities, checking weather, NOTAMs and flight plans, which all looked okay. It looked like it was going to be a very pleasant flight down towards the Canary Islands. So after having boarded everyone and completed the pre-flight setup, the crew started up their engines and taxied out for takeoff from Manchester at time 9:22 am, with the captain as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. Now, the climb out and cruise phases of this flight went off without a hitch, but the pilots then likely started preparing and briefing for the approach a bit earlier than usual on this day. And that was because they had seen during their pre-flight briefing that the approach they had ahead of them was possibly going to be a little bit unusual. You see, in the Canary Islands, the prevailing winds normally blew from the Atlantic Ocean in the west, causing most flights to approach from the east using runway 30 in order to land with a headwind. But on this afternoon, the wind was instead blowing from the other direction, from the east, forcing inbound aircraft to approach the reciprocal runway 12 instead. Now, we don't know how many times the captain or the other crew members had actually used runway 12 in the past, but it was likely not something that they did very often. And to make things even worse, Tenerife North Airport was, and still is, notorious for its frequent, fast-building fog that can appear from nowhere within minutes. The airport sits at 2,000 feet above sea level on a shoulder between two mountains, and the marine fog that forms over the ocean frequently collides with the western slopes of Tenerife and then gets funneled through the gap directly over the airfield. But like I mentioned before, on this day the reported weather at the airport was more or less okay, with around 6 kilometers of visibility and scattered clouds at 400 feet, broken at 800 feet and further scattered clouds at 1,100 feet with some light drizzle. Not great for sunbathing, but good enough for normal landings. But these cloud layers also meant that higher up on the mountainsides the fog was extremely thick. So thick in fact that a weather station located at a close to 8,000 feet elevation on the mountainside reported nil visibility. This meant that the very high terrain south of the airport would be completely obscured, including the nearly 12,200 foot Teide volcano, which is the defining geographical feature on Tenerife. Because of that, the minimum safe altitude in the airspace south of Tenerife North Airport was 14,500 feet, which is worth remembering. Anyway, as the flight neared the Canary Islands, the first officer made contact with the Las Palmas Area Control Center, who soon cleared them to descend down to 11,000 feet. The first officer read this back and the crew initiated the descent, and after they reached that altitude they contacted the Tenerife North approach controller and reported that they were now 14 nautical miles away from the Tango Foxtrot November VOR beacon and that they were ready to receive their approach instructions. Now before we continue here, it's probably worth explaining a bit more about the different approach aids that the crew were now going to use as well as their procedures. A VOR beacon, where VOR stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range, is a type of radio navigation beacon that was very widely used in the days before GPS and is actually still quite common, especially here in Europe. These VORs emit signals that are modulated differently depending on the direction of the emission, which allow the VOR receivers on board aircraft to determine the precise magnetic bearing from the VOR to the aircraft. This enables the pilots to navigate using imaginary lines or radials defined by a particular bearing from the beacon. So, for example, the 270-degree radial from the VOR points due west and so on. A lot of airports have VORs installed to help pilots locate the airport before starting to maneuver for the approach. And it can also be used to align the aircraft with the runway as an approach aid if an instrument landing system, ILS, is not available. But in this case, the Tango Foxtrot November VOR was not actually located at the airport. Instead, it was sitting on a hilltop a few miles northeast of the airport in order to maximize its detectable range. Now located at the northeast end of runway 1230, there was a less sophisticated beacon called an NDB locator with the Morse code identifier Foxtrot Papa. A non-directional beacon, or NDB, is a radio aid that can be tracked using an automatic direction finder, an ADF. And this is a very simple instrument which just points in the direction that a signal is coming from, but it doesn't contain any radial information, which makes NDB navigation less precise than navigating using a VOR. In this case, because the Foxtrot Papa beacon was used to mark the entry point to the approach procedure for runway 12, it was also known as a locator, rather than just an NDB. And in order to approach runway 12, a flight inbound from the northeast, like this flight was, would normally need to fly first via the Tango Foxtrot November VOR and then turn southwest onto radial 255 directly towards the Foxtrot Papa NDB. After reaching the Foxtrot Papa, the aircraft should then turn right onto an outbound heading of 302 degrees, which would take it out over the ocean, before making a teardrop course reversal to the left back towards the airport. And from that point the aircraft would be in a position to pick up the instrument landing system, which would then guide the aircraft the rest of the way down to the runway. Now this was quite a bit more complicated than the more commonly used runway 30 approach, which just involved flying to an NDB called Tango X-ray, from where the instrument landing system could then be picked up immediately. Now the reason that these procedures had to be flown this way was that there was no radar available at Los Rodeos Airport, so all approaches had to be intercepted using procedural arrivals. But then again, flying procedural approaches would not have been very uncommon back then, and there was nothing in this procedure that was particularly out of the ordinary. Except maybe that high terrain to the southwest, which I mentioned before. And when we're on the subject of things that are out of the ordinary, have you noticed that some countries have now blocked the ability to make video calls from within their borders? Well, I have, and that was a bit of an issue recently when I needed to have a group call with my team to plan one of my videos. But luckily, I had today's sponsor, my trusted NordVPN, available to me. With the help of Nord, I could easily just change my virtual location to another country with a click of a button, and after that, voila, everything worked perfectly again. NordVPN has actually turned into an essential tool for my team and I, not only for accessing geo-restricted articles for our research, but also to enable safe and encrypted browsing, especially when using dodgy free Wi-Fi hotspots at airports, restaurants and hotels. On top of that, Nord have also added loads of really effective cybersecurity tools that help pre-scan emails for malware, block ads and much more. Now, making them much more than just a normal VPN. So if you want to add this great tool to your toolbox, they now have a really incredible offer for my viewers. Just go to nordvpn.com/pilot and you will get 4 extra months for free when you sign up for the 2-year plan. And as always, you don't really risk anything since Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Nord. And now, where were we? Yes. After establishing contact at time 13:16, the Tenerife North controller cleared the flight to descend down to 6,000 feet in preparation to cross Tango Foxtrot November and then to enter the approach procedure. The captain dialed in the new cleared altitude, the flight engineer reduced thrust in order to descend, and the first officer then reported when the aircraft was 7 nautical miles away from the Tango Fox November beacon in order to get further instructions. At that same time, he also requested the local air pressure, QNH, in order to get the correct reference to the altitude above the sea, and also the QFE, which would give him the altitude reference over the airfield. Once those values had been received and set, they were then cross-checked in accordance with their standard operating procedures. And the captain now also suggested that the first officer should tune the ILS frequency on his navigational radio box, and he also confirmed that the outbound heading after Foxtrot Papa would be 302 degrees. So at this stage, everything was completely normal, and the crew seemed to have a good grasp of the procedure they had in front of them. But just a few miles ahead, an island-hopping turboprop belonging to Spain's flag carrier Iberia was also on approach to runway 12, and the crew on board that aircraft were communicating with the controller in Spanish. Now, the pilots of flight 1008 didn't understand Spanish, and from their conversations, it doesn't seem like they paid much attention to that aircraft at all. Instead, they continued to monitor their position relative to the Tango Fox November VR, and at time 13, 18 and 15 seconds, the captain called out, "Just about to go overhead." The first officer then reminded the captain that the procedure called for them to leave Tango Fox November on radial 255, but as it turns out, the aircraft actually passed a little less than a mile east of the VOR, and after passing Beamit, they were also slow to make the right turn, which meant that they never actually intercepted that 255 radial. Now, we can never know for sure why this happened, but it was most likely done on purpose. You see, the distance between Tango Fox November and Foxtrot Papa was very short, and flight 1008 was traveling at an airspeed of around 250 knots when they passed the beamed VOR. Today, we wouldn't fly that fast when starting a tight procedure like this, since our aircraft are now very slippery and take time to decelerate. But older aircraft like the 727 had much less effective wings, which meant that they could easily keep the speeds up high for longer, since the speed would just rapidly bleed off when the thrust levels were closed. This also meant that most jets approaching Tenerife back then, including this one, would normally overshoot this first turn slightly before correcting course in order to be able to intercept the 302 outbound course from the NDB at a slightly more comfortable angle. There was so little time between Tango Fox November and Foxtrot Papa that they probably wouldn't be able to intercept the radial anyway. And on top of that, if they flew directly over Foxtrot Papa, they would potentially overshoot the pattern significantly, which could take the aircraft into the area south of the airport where the minimum safe altitude was 14,500 feet. Now, this is obviously not how this was supposed to be done. A lower speed would have solved all of those issues, but sometimes procedural shortcuts like this can start to creep in due to pure convenience and time saving. And if I was to guess, this was likely the reason that the captain of this flight flew a bit wide around the Tango Fox November. Now, due to some radio chatter with the Hapag-Lloyd flight that was taking off from Los Rodeos plus some other distractions, the flight crew didn't actually report crossing Tango Fox November until 33 seconds after they had passed the B-MIT. And like I mentioned, Tenerife North Airport didn't have radar at the time, so position reports like this were the only way for the controller to determine where the traffic was located. As a result, when the crew reported that they had just passed Tango Fox November, the controller realized that the 727 was traveling so fast that it would risk getting too close to the slower Iberia turboprop in front of them if he didn't do something. So he hastily decided to put Flight 1008 into a holding pattern in order to ensure sufficient traffic separation. At time 13, 18 and 54 seconds, the approach controller transmitted the following message. Roger, the standard holding overhead Foxtrot Papa is inbound heading 150, turn to the left, call you back shortly. And this would end up being the critical moment that put the accident sequence into motion, so let's take a moment to analyze why. Despite the controller's statement that this was a standard holding, there was actually no officially published holding pattern around the Foxtrot Papa beacon. There was a published holding around Tango Fox November as well as around Tango X-Ray, forming part of the go-around procedure for runway 12, but Flight 1008 was not in a position to enter any of those. Instead, the controller essentially invented a holding pattern based on Foxtrot Papa, and he did so quickly that this was likely not the first time that he had used this particular pattern. Now, it's not wrong or illegal to make up holding patterns. In fact, that happens all the time, and it's perfectly okay as long as it doesn't cause any issues with terrain or traffic separation. But the issue here was that the controller said that this was a standard holding, which would imply that the holding could be found in the published approach charts and therefore needed to be verified by the pilots. On top of that, the entry into this suddenly proposed holding pattern would not be very simple from the position that the aircraft was now coming from. What the controller wanted the aircraft to do was to join a left-hand holding pattern over Foxtrot Papa with an inbound course of 150 degrees and an outbound course of 330 degrees. If it was flown that way, it would keep the airplane over relatively low terrain. But to do this, Flight 1008 would have to first fly over the beacon, then turn right onto heading of 330, fly outbound for 1 minute, perform a course reversal and then proceed inbound to Foxtrot Papa again on the requested inbound course. Quite a complex maneuver to fly when you're almost over the beacon. Now, the pilots might have eventually figured this out, if not for a tiny slip of the tongue by the controller, which changed this entire course of events. Remember that the controller wanted Flight 1008 to fly counterclockwise around the holding pattern, making left turns? Well, this meant that what he wanted to say was turns to the left, but what he actually ended up saying was turn to the left, which has a very different meaning. Turn to the left is normally interpreted as a command to turn left right away, which was not at all what the controller wanted them to do here. What he attempted to say was only a description of the holding pattern, which is technically just informational, not an order. And that also made sense given that he didn't have any radar available. Spanish investigators later used this to argue that the controller didn't bear any responsibility for issuing a non-standard clearance, but given how his call actually sounded to the pilots, that's not completely fair. Anyway, when the flight crew received this message from the controller, they simply replied "Roger" with no further readback or request for confirmation. They might have thought at first that they understood what he said, but within 10 seconds the captain realized that he wasn't able to picture what the controller was asking from him, so he said, "That's an odd sort of one, the runway." He then interrupted himself with a confirmation that they had 1,000 feet to go to their cleared altitude of 6,000 feet, and after that the first officer said, "No, I'm not, suppose it's all right?" The captain continued with, "I'll just turn straight round to the left onto 150 when I go overhead then," to which the first officer seemed to agree. Now, this shows that the captain clearly believed that he had been told to turn left onto heading 150 after crossing Foxtrot Papa, which again was not at all what the controller had intended. A command to turn to the left was completely incompatible with an instruction to fly a holding pattern inbound on 150 degrees to Foxtrot Papa, since, like what I said earlier, that would require a right turn followed by a course reversal. So in the captain's mind, the instructions didn't make sense, but he had been able to pick out two elements in the message which seemed clear to him: 150 and turn to the left. So with Foxtrot Papa now coming up in less than 1 minute, he didn't have a lot of time to figure it out. In a stressful situation, without fully comprehending what the controller had said, he accepted that the best thing to do was just to execute the part of the clearance that he understood, and then try to figure out the rest later. In hindsight, it's easy to say that he shouldn't have acted on an incomplete understanding of those instructions, but in that moment, with the sudden time pressure and the added workload of the sudden holding clearance, it would have been a lot harder to think with that kind of clarity. And it is also worth remembering that this all happened in a 727 cockpit with no fancy navigation displays, only dials. Besides, the CVR transcripts suggest that both the first officer and the flight engineer were looking at the charts when this all happened, likely searching for that standard holding in order to be able to verify it. And the first officer had said, "I suppose it's all right," which might have reinforced the captain's belief that he had understood the clearance correctly. Anyway, seconds later, having made his decision on how to fly, the captain focused his attention on the rapid approach of the Foxtrot Papa NDB. He said, "The only this is, we're just about to miss it. It's too close." At this point, the captain and first officer also agreed to tune both automatic direction finders to the frequency of the Foxtrot Papa so that they could track it more easily during the holding pattern. And finally, at time 13, 19 and 46 seconds, they passed a beam Foxtrot Papa slightly to the southeast, and the captain called it out. This prompted the first officer to report the waypoint passage to the controller, and he also confirmed that they were now taking up the hold. But in reality, they actually kept flying straight ahead for another about 20 seconds, covering around 2 nautical miles before beginning the left turn. Now, the reason for this delay isn't really known, but it might have been because the pilots were still trying to wrap their heads around the maneuver that they now had ahead of them. In fact, a few seconds before they began that left turn, the first officer said, "Oh, this strange hold, isn't it?" which indicates that he was still mentally focused on the confusing instructions. In response to that, the captain said, "Yeah, it isn't parallel with the runway or anything." Now, I just want to stop here and drive home what is probably one of the most important points of this whole video. If something seems strange with the clearance and you get that pit in the stomach feeling that something just isn't right, always speak up and ask for further clarification. This goes for all walks of life and all industries, but especially if you're flying an aircraft. It's always better to ask one time too many than one time too few, and I want every one of you out there to remember that. This, by the way, is also exactly the kind of discussions that I'm having regularly on my Zoom Hangouts with my Patreon crew, and I hope to see you there as well next time. Just go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot if you think that sounds interesting. Anyway, at this point, what the flight crew didn't yet know was that by overshooting Foxtrot Papa and then turning left onto a heading of 150 degrees, they were now on a track to overfly the northern shoulder of La Esperanza, a sub-peak along the island's central volcanic ridge that stretched north from El Teide. The terrain directly beneath their projected flight path actually didn't exceed 5,000 feet, but it did lie within the sector where the minimum safe altitude was 14,500 feet. So strictly speaking, since they weren't flying a published procedure, maneuvering at only 6,000 feet would have been prohibited in this area. The final report would later place some blame on the flight crew for flying into this area without being aware of the applicable MSA, but it seems likely that at this point they were still thinking that they were flying an official procedure, even though they couldn't find it on their charts. At the same time as Flight 1008 completed their left turn onto heading of 150 and started flying towards the southeast, the approach controller called up the Iberia Airlines flight ahead of them and asked them to verify when they had left 5,000 feet. Only seconds later, the pilot of that aircraft replied that 5,000 feet was now free and that they were in the middle of the procedure turn to intercept the ILS. As these calls in Spanish were happening, the first officer and flight engineer on board Flight 1008 continued to compare ATC's instructions with what was printed on their chart, saying things like, it's that way, isn't it? That's a tree, isn't it? And yes, well, the hold is going to be here, isn't it? It's likely that they were now very skeptical about the maneuver that they were flying, but we can never be 100% sure since that wasn't formally verbalized. Anyway, as these discussions were taking place, the controller now called them up and cleared them to descend down to 5,000 feet since the Iberia flight had now left that altitude. And in response, the flight engineer again reduced the thrust and the captain initiated the descent. But as they were doing this, the captain suddenly said, "Hey, did he say it was 150 inbound?" Likely realizing that his mental picture of where the controller was sending them didn't actually make any sense. The first officer had probably suspected that from the very start because he now replied, "Inbound, yeah." And in response to that, the captain said, I don't like that." The first officer continued by saying, "They want us to keep going more around, don't they?" It's not completely clear what he meant by that, but it is possible that the first officer believed that they were supposed to keep turning left, making a 3/4 turn onto the outbound leg of the holding pattern, after which they would come back to Foxtrot Papa on the inbound heading of 150. If that was the case, it would mean that even the first officer had indeed interpreted the call from the controller as an instruction to turn left, and that would also explain why he hadn't spoken up when the turn started. When I read this part of the report, I could really feel that cold feeling in my stomach. You know, that feeling that you get when you realize that something is really wrong, but you still can't figure out what or how. Well, we don't know if the pilots had yet realized just how dangerous their current flight path was, but the captain's statement of, "I don't like that," definitely showed some real concern. Again, make sure you always know what clearance you have been given, and if in doubt, ask. Anyway, before the pilots could spend much more time trying to work out what was wrong, the ground proximity warning system suddenly activated at time 13, 20 and 50 seconds. The Boeing 727 was equipped with a first generation GPWS, which was state of the art at the time, but also much less capable than the enhanced ground proximity warning systems that we have on board today's aircraft. Modern eGPWSs compares the position and projected path of the airplane to a digital terrain database. But the original GPSs could only look at the terrain directly beneath the aircraft using its radio altimeter. If the closure rate with the terrain was too high, it would then issue sink rate or pull up warnings, but if the terrain ahead of the aircraft was rising steeply, the system wouldn't know that, so these warnings could still come too late. In this case, the airplane was now passing over the northern shoulder of the central volcanic ridge while in descent, and that resulted in a rate of terrain closure greater than 6,000 feet per minute, triggering the warning envelope. But the maximum height of the ridge ahead of them was actually less than their current altitude, so in their present trajectory they were not in any danger of striking the terrain. But of course the pilots, who had now lost their position, situational awareness and were still flying inside of the clouds, had no way of knowing this. So in response to the GPWS warning, the captain immediately announced, "Okay, overshoot," which is an old British term for go around. As the flight engineer advanced the thrust levels to the takeoff go-around thrust, the captain also halted their left turn and added, "He's taking us around to the high ground." And after stating that, he continued rolling right onto a steeper and steeper right-hand turn. But what he didn't do was to raise the nose in order to initiate the climb. And why was that then? Well, during GPWS response training, we pilots today are required to practice a terrain escape maneuver in the simulator, which includes disconnecting the automatics, setting full thrust, pitching up to 20 degrees, making sure the speed brake lever is down, making proper call-outs and so on. This maneuver is drilled into everyone flying today in order to make sure that the response to a hard GPWS warning is immediately executed from memory and without questions. As it turns out, the captain and the flight engineer had also undergone some type of GPWS training back in 1978, and Dan Air did have a procedure for GPWS response, but back in those days, GPWS was a very new technology, and there is a possibility that the training had been only theoretical. So we don't know exactly what was going through the captain's head, but based on his statement that he's taking us around to the high ground, he probably believed that the controller's instruction to turn left was faulty and that the controller had told them to turn towards an unsafe direction. Believing that the GPWS warning occurred because they were turning left towards high terrain, the captain may have reasoned that the best way to escape the situation was to turn to the right instead. So without having practiced the maneuver in a simulator, the captain's immediate reaction was to turn rather than to climb, which sadly would seal their fate. Because as the right turn now continued, the aircraft passed over the top of the ridge and then over a valley, causing the radio altitude to increase, which silenced the GPWS warning 10 seconds after it had started. The captain commented, "Watch my EPRs," referring to the engine pressure ratio or EPR, essentially ensuring that the flight engineer maintained toga thrust and didn't overboost the engines. But it also now seems like the first officer wasn't convinced that they were now taking the right course of action, so he called out, "I suggest a heading of 122 actually, and take us through the overshoot." A heading of 122 degrees was the heading prescribed by the official runway 12 missed approach procedure, which would take them east over the ocean, so this was a pretty sensible suggestion. But 122 degrees was also to the left of their current heading, which contradicted the captain's assumption that their left turn was what had caused the GPWS warning. As a result, he just continued turning right, past due south and then all the way around to the southwest, directly towards the 5,700 foot high summit of La Esperanza. Tragically, they might still have cleared the summit if they had just maintained altitude or climbed following the terrain escape maneuver. But due to the high bank angle they were now using, the plane actually lost lift during the maneuver, causing a slight descent instead. Still flying over the valley, the flight engineer expressed his nervousness by commenting, "Let's get out of here." But the captain simply repeated, "He's taking us around to the high ground." Moments later, without any new GPWS warnings and believing that he had corrected the situation, the captain called up air traffic control and reported, "Dan Air 1008, we've had a ground proximity warning." This was then followed by the flight engineer calling out twice that their bank angle was now above the recommended maximum of 30 degrees. And his words were the last ones captured on the cockpit voice recorder. With the mountains shrouded in clouds, the pilots never saw the danger coming towards them, and the GPWS never had time to react to the closure rate of the steep mountain ahead. So, at time 13, 21 and 18 seconds, Dan Air Flight 1008 crashed into the forested mountainside of La Esperanza at a speed of 260 knots, just 38 meters below the top of the ridge. Most of the aircraft disintegrated immediately, killing everyone on board, and a large portion of the aft cabin was then thrown another 250 meters forward over the top of the ridge and then down to the other side. Down at the airport, the controller now tried repeatedly to contact the aircraft in order to follow up on their reported GPWS warning, but when he didn't get any reply, he soon activated the accident alarm. The problem was though that with no radar available at Tenerife North, rescuers had no idea where the aircraft was located, especially since it had taken a turn that the controller had not intended them to take. This meant that the wreckage wasn't discovered until 7 hours after the crash, when a couple of motorists on the road to the Teide National Park saw some debris on the road and correlated that to the radio reports of a missing aircraft. This crash was, and actually still is, the worst loss of life on board a British airliner ever, so the investigation received considerable public attention. Especially when the Spanish and British investigators didn't agree on how to weigh the causes of the accident. The Spanish investigators wrote that the pilots were ultimately responsible for being aware of their position in a non-radar environment, and that it was their obligation to climb to a safe altitude as soon as they became unsure of where they actually were. They also cited the pilots' failure to request clarification when they didn't understand the controller's initial transmission as a major cause of the accident, as well as their incorrect response to the GPWS warning. They pointed out that if the pilots had done nothing at all when the GPWS activated, they would have passed safely over the ridge and continued out over the sea. So the Spanish investigators argued that it was the captain's decision to turn right that took them back around to the high terrain and ultimately led to the crash. But the British investigation team believed that the controller's use of an unpublished holding pattern, one that didn't appear on the pilot's chart, as well as his verbal slip-up saying turn instead of turns, played a very important role in the pilot's loss of situational awareness. They also noted that if the holding pattern had been designed according to international standards, the minimum altitude in the hold would have been 6,000 feet, which would have incidentally prevented the crash. But regardless of who made the most serious errors here, the disaster was made possible by the poor infrastructure at Tenerife North Airport, including the lack of radar and the poorly designed approach procedures. It's also important to remember that the technology available in 1980 was far less capable than what we now have available, and it's exactly because of accidents like this that we today have these vastly improved systems and that we pilots are so well trained in using them. This accident led to recommendations to always question any clearances that weren't 100% clear, as well as some other recommendations as well. But in the long run, this accident also led to better training around GPWS maneuvers and therefore a significant increase in safety. Our current fantastic safety record proves that accidents like these today are largely preventable. But they are only preventable because of stories like this, and that's why I keep telling them. Now, please consider subscribing to the channel if you found this video interesting, and let me know what you thought in the comments below. Watch these videos next, and remember to check out my sponsor who made this video possible, together with my fantastic Patreon crew. If you want to see my next video before everyone else, just go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot if you think that sounds interesting. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!